Well, good morning, everyone. As I discussed for CRIM 2 Online, occasionally I will put some videos on the blackboard so that you can get a better understanding of what's going on in the course, just in case there's some misunderstandings or ambiguities associated with the course content. And so in chapter 1, basically what we have is an overview of everything associated with the criminal justice system. And when we talk about the criminal justice system, it's important for us to understand what is meant by the term criminal justice system. Each one of these terms can be broken down incrementally. And so, to begin, we must understand what is meant by the word system. Some would say the word system means a whole comprised of interdependent parts. And in that regard, we must consider, if you will, that the criminal justice system is not comprised of any one particular entity, that it functions as a result of the independent efforts of numerous entities like the police, like the courts, like the prison system. And so those being the three major institutions of the criminal justice system, when we talk about criminal justice as a system, we're generally speaking of it in terms of police, courts, and corrections. Each one of those entities acting virtually independent in and of themselves. But to some degree, we have to think of the system as also incorporating other elements that are external to that system, those being the law, those being the general public, politics, etc. And so we'll talk briefly about some of those external entities and the role that they play. But also, we must understand to what degree is the meaning of criminal justice. And in understanding what is justice, we must also understand what is a criminal and or what is crime. And so obviously being a criminal is relevant to or related to what is the law. And so in many ways, the law is a function of what we as the general public think of as values and norms of our society. Now, all values and norms don't, result in some form of law. Some things are not violations of the law, which might be considered a norm. For instance, here in California, what is a norm is this idea of being able to use recreational marijuana, whereas in other places that is not necessarily something that is acceptable. So many of these norms may vary geographically or chronologically. For instance, many years ago, in terms of chronology, many years ago, perhaps in my grandmother's time, it was okay for someone to marry at age 14. Nowadays, if someone is married at such a young age, especially if that individual is more than 3 years older than them, that is considered to be statutory rape. And so we've changed some of the laws in relation to what is considered to be normal in our society. And for that regard, what is a crime tends to vary when we look at various time periods, and additionally when we look at different locations among the United States. But ultimately, these norms or laws, if you will, tend to structure what is acceptable in our society. And for that reason, it becomes important for us to understand and examine the complexities of the law to better understand, how and why our criminal justice system operates in the manner that it does. And so when we analyze the term justice, justice is primarily an issue of enforcement. Are we being fair in the manner in which we administer justice, in terms of determining guilt, in terms of determining what the necessary punishments or penalties for a violation of the laws or norms of our society should be? And so in that regard, when we talk about criminal justice, in many ways we're talking about the enforcement of those penalties associated with the law. And when we add the term system to that, then that begins to make us think about all of those different or various entities that are involved in that process, whether that be police, courts, and corrections, or whether that be other entities like interest groups who tend to have an effect on the justice system, whether that be victims who in recent years have had a tremendous effect on what we do in the criminal justice system. The public, we as the general public, do have some influence, seeing as how in a democratic society, theoretically, it is a government of the people, and those politicians enact laws on our behalf. And so, in that regard, the public does have a particular role to play, as well as politicians. So, just to begin, like I said, the basic overview of the criminal justice system is sometimes a bit more complex than we actually realize. And many of those other entities, like the politicians who make laws, determine how resources are allocated, where we're going to get new police and new substations for the police, things of that nature, play a particularly important role in responding to the needs of the public in such a way that is reflective of what the public wants. Ideally speaking, they act in the best interest of us as civilians or general citizens. Now, while this may not always be the case, we do have to take into account that, at least from a philosophical standpoint, this is the way our criminal justice system is intended to work. On the other hand, we might also look at the general public, that they have a particular role to play in assisting our criminal justice system, seeing as how if the public doesn't report crimes, it makes the job of the police much harder. If they're not willing to stand trial and serve on juries, it makes prosecuting criminals a bit more difficult. So they have a role to play in terms of acting as witnesses and even coming to the aid of our neighbors in an attempt to deter crime. Part of the purpose of me posting the story of Kitty Genovese was so that many of you can see, to some extent, what the importance of the public really is to the police. Because obviously the police can't be everywhere all the time, and seeing as how that's simply not possible, it becomes particularly important that the public act on behalf of the police and other entities, first responders, etc., to rid our society of crime to the extent that that's possible. So just keep these things in mind, that while the criminal justice system is comprised of three main subcomponents or subsystems, those being police, courts, and corrections, it's also important to understand that the criminal justice system as a system is bigger than the sum of its parts. There are more entities involved that also play an important role, though perhaps less of a role, but it is equally important to some degree. Now, we're not going to go over each and every slide that is included in the Chapter 1 discussion, but we will, to some extent, try to clear up a few ambiguities. For instance, in terms of the origins of government power, sometimes we never take any time to really consider where the powers of government originate from and what makes those powers of government legitimate. And we discuss the role of legitimacy. Quite frankly, what we're talking about is the public trust. How does the police or the courts or even the prison system maintain the public trust? Does it operate in a manner that is legitimate in the eyes of the public? Is it fair in the things that it does? And if so, generally speaking, we could argue that the government is operating in its legitimate role. And so from that standpoint, we might consider some of the early thinkers in this regard, individuals like Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes, who came along at a time when there was a big debate about this concept of inalienable rights, the idea that everyone was born with the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And these concepts being something that could not be taken away, to some extent, the role of the government originates from this idea in that people require the government in an attempt to secure these inalienable rights, seeing as how there's absolutely no way that any of us can protect ourselves from all potential threats, both foreign and domestic. So it became necessary for us to relinquish some of our rights, or if you will, or invest them in the hands of a few trusted individuals that comprise the government for the protection of these rights, life, liberty, and property. And seeing as how the chief purpose of the government is the protection of property, many of us join together in what is known as a theoretical social contract. The important thing for you to realize is that social contract is not, there was no actual contract that was drawn up amongst the citizens in early American society. But this idea that the powers of government originate from the people in a democratic society, as we have surrendered some of our rights of self-protection. Each one of us having the right to protect ourselves, but at the same time realizing that as people are often irrational and selfish, it is unlikely that me as an individual can protect myself from all the possible individuals or threats, if you will, that will come against me, especially if I own a lot of property. It's just not possible. And so the idea is basically that we need an entity like the U.S. government to protect us, or even the state government or local government to protect us from would-be criminals in the event that they might decide to steal from us or injure us in some manner. And so it is argued that the powers of government originate in this manner based on two competing perspectives, those being the consensus perspective and the conflict perspective. And so to some extent, the idea is that there's a consensus among us as general citizens that we all want to be protected from crime. This idea that by and large, none of us are hoping to get mugged on our way out to our car, or while walking from the mall to the parking lot. Most of us are not hoping to get assaulted by some criminal hiding in the bushes or whatnot. Most of us are not looking to get raped while we're out on a date or anything of that nature. And so we have a general consensus that we'd all like to be protected from crime, that our property should be protected. And in doing so, we all to some extent agree to allow the government to, put forth certain penalties on behalf of us as citizens. So laws, if you will, are a product of our own social agreement, and in this regard, they tend to promote solidarity for those of us who, are law-abiding citizens. We can unite against such issues like violent crime, and in doing so, the society as a whole is, to some degree, made stronger, if you will, because we have some sense of agreement on these very basic issues. And so we might argue that to some extent, this is why many behaviors are made criminal, but others may not be. For instance, the idea of homicide is pretty much in any society been a criminal issue. But in some societies, other issues may not be a matter of a violation of the law. And so the conflict approach helps us better understand why these other issues perhaps may, if you will, may not be a violation of the law in some societies, because the conflict approach suggests that government works to the advantages of those individuals who have enough power to control it. And to some extent, we might consider this to be those elite classes in our society, like the wealthy. But on the other hand, we might look at this in a democratic society from a majoritarian standpoint, that we as minorities don't really have the same power, if you will, because we lack a numerical advantage. And so some would argue the reason minorities are sometimes bearing the brunt of police enforcement has to do with this conflict between us as classes and, if you will, also us as races. And so in this regard, this is why in some areas, things like possession or use of recreational marijuana may not be a violation of the law, because those with the power to control it have decided that either they do or do not want it to be a legal violation. For instance, in the South, what is often called the Bible Belt, places like Texas and Mississippi, where I'm from, a minuscule amount of marijuana would be a violation of the law. And so the basic idea behind the conflict approach and this idea of where governmental power originates from is that these minor conflicts between us as individuals tend to influence which laws are created. And those groups that have the most power are able to ensure that laws are not created that hinder the things or behaviors that they want to engage in. So just keep this in mind in terms of the origin of government power.